December 1943. Over the frozen skies of Germany, American P-51 Mustangs were falling from the sky at a rate of 1 every 17 minutes. Not from dogfights, not from flak, but from something far more insidious battle damage that turned minor hits into catastrophic failures. Wing punctures that should have been survivable became death sentences. The Luftwaffe knew it. They aimed for the wings, then watched as American pilots limped home only to spiral into the channel. 347 pilots lost in 6 weeks. Then came Captain James "Red" Morrison, a maintenance officer from Nebraska, who'd never fired a shot in anger with an idea so ridiculous, so flagrantly against every military regulation that it would save over 2,000 American lives and change aerial combat forever. His weapon, a flattened Coca-Cola can and birthday candle wax. The winter of 1943 was the darkest period of the Allied bombing campaign over Europe. Everyday waves of B-17 flying fortresses crossed the channel, escorted by fighters that were faster and more agile than anything the world had ever seen. The P-51 Mustang was supposed to be invincible. With its laminar flow wing and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver any German fighter. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it had a fatal flaw. The wing design that made it so fast also made it extraordinarily vulnerable to battle damage. A single 7.92mm round through the wing's thin aluminum skin could compromise the entire airfoil. The laminar flow that gave the P-51 its speed depended on perfectly smooth surfaces. One hole, one dent, one irregularity, and the airflow separated. When airflow separated, lift decreased. When lift decreased on one wing, the plane entered an uncontrollable roll. Pilots called it the death spiral. You had maybe 8 seconds before you hit terminal velocity. Bailout was nearly impossible. By December 1943, the numbers were catastrophic. Fighter Command had lost more P-51s to wing damage and subsequent crashes than to enemy fire. Pilots were coming back with holes in their wings, the size of baseballs, flying on pure skill and prayer. Some made it. Most didn't. The standard procedure was to land immediately, ground the aircraft, and send it back to depot maintenance for proper repair. This meant cutting out the damaged section, riveting in a new panel, and re-smoothing the entire wing surface. It took 3 days minimum. 3 days that plane couldn't fly. 3 days those bombers went unescorted. 3 days more pilots died. The engineering teams at Wright Field had tried everything. Aluminum patches with marine-grade rivets, fabric dope like the old biplanes, even experimental plastics that cost more than the airplane itself. Nothing worked in combat conditions. The patches either peeled off at high speed, cracked in the cold, or disrupted the airflow even worse than the original hole. One test pilot reported that the official patch kit made his plane fly like a brick with wings. The rejection rate was 100%. Captain James Morrison wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the front lines. At 34, he was too old for combat duty, and his skill set was all wrong. Before the war, he'd been an automotive machinist in Lincoln, Nebraska, specializing in bodywork and custom fabrication. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army took one look at his resume and assigned him to maintenance. Not flight maintenance, ground maintenance. His job was to keep the tractors running, repair bullet holes in Jeeps, and occasionally weld a fuel tank. He'd never even sat in a P-51. But Morrison had one advantage nobody else did. He understood airflow. Not from textbooks or engineering degrees, but from 10 years of making cars go faster. He knew that a smooth surface wasn't about being perfectly flat. It was about managing the boundary layer, the thin film of air that clung to any moving surface. He knew that sometimes a small imperfection could actually improve flow if placed correctly. And he knew that the official solution was often wrong because it was designed by people who'd never gotten their hands dirty. November 28, 1943. Morrison was working late in the maintenance hangar at Bodney Airfield when Lieutenant Bobby Hewitt limped in with his P-51 tail number 413522. The plane had taken a 20-millimeter cannon shell through the right wing 5 feet from the fuselage. The hole was the size of a dinner plate, edges peeled back like flower petals. Hewitt was white-knuckled and shaking. He'd made it back on pure instinct, fighting the controls every second. Morrison walked around the wing, running his fingers along the torn aluminum. He could feel the airflow disruption even standing still. The regulations were clear. Ground the aircraft. Wait for depot maintenance. 3 days minimum. But Morrison saw something else. The way the metal had torn it had created a sharp edge pointing forward, a tiny spoiler that was tripping the airflow. If he could just smooth that edge and fill the hole with something that matched the wing's contour, the plane might fly better than before. It was insane. It violated every regulation in the technical manual. But it might work. Morrison didn't ask permission because he knew the answer would be no. Instead, he waited until the night shift went home, then returned to the hangar with supplies scrounged from the base PX and his own footlocker. One empty Coca-Cola can saved from his birthday ration. A stub of red candle from a care package. A ball-peen hammer and his personal set of metalworking files. He worked by flashlight, moving quickly but carefully. First, he cut the Coca-Cola can into strips, then hammered them flat on the hangar floor. The aluminum was thinner than aircraft grade, but it was also more flexible, easier to shape. He formed the strips into a shallow dome that matched the wing's curve, overlapping them like scales. Then came the dangerous part. He lit the candle and held each piece over the flame, heating it just enough to make the metal pliable without weakening it. When the aluminum reached the right temperature, he pressed it into place over the hole, using the candle wax as both adhesive and sealant. The wax filled the gaps between strips, creating a smooth surface. He worked for 4 hours, shaping and smoothing, checking the contour with his fingers in the darkness. By 0300 hours, the patch was complete. From 10 feet away, you could barely see it. Up close, it looked like someone had glued a Coca-Cola can to a $50,000 fighter plane, which was exactly what had happened. Morrison had no way to test his repair except to wait for Hewitt to fly. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just sat in the hangar staring at that wing, wondering if he'd just killed a man. At 0600, Hewitt showed up for the morning briefing. When he saw his plane still on the line instead of grounded, he assumed maintenance had cleared it. Nobody told him about the Coca-Cola patch. Nobody told him he was flying an illegal repair held together with birthday candle wax. He just climbed in, started the engine, and took off. Morrison watched from the tarmac, heart hammering. The P-51 rolled, lifted and climbed normally. The wing held. Hewitt joined his formation and disappeared into the morning clouds, heading for Germany. Morrison went back to his quarters and vomited from stress. The mission was a bomber escort to Schweinfurt, one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. Hewitt's squadron ran into a swarm of Bf-109Gs over the Rhine, 4 German fighters in their signature Finger 4 formation. The dogfight was vicious, and vertical planes pulling 7 Gs in climbing spirals and snap rolls. Hewitt's P-51 performed flawlessly. Better than flawlessly. The patched wing was actually generating more lift than the undamaged one, giving him a tighter turn radius. He didn't understand why. He just knew his plane was responding like never before. In 8 minutes of combat, Hewitt shot down 3 Messerschmitts. 3. Most pilots never got one. He landed back at Bodny 4 hours later with his guns empty and his fuel gauge on fumes, grinning like a madman. When the crew chief saw the red Coca-Cola patch on his wing still intact, still smooth, he went straight to the maintenance officer. That maintenance officer went to the base commander. The base commander went to Morrison. Colonel Richard Hayes was not a man who appreciated initiative. He was a by-the-book officer who believed regulations existed for a reason, and that reason was to keep people alive. When he saw what Morrison had done, his first instinct was to court-martial him. Unauthorized modifications to military aircraft, use of non-approved materials, violation of at least 15 separate technical orders. It was a career-ending offense. But then Hayes looked at the mission report. 3 kills, no mechanical issues, and Hewitt swearing the plane flew better than it ever had. Hayes was a political creature, but he wasn't stupid. He ordered Morrison to repair 3 more damaged P-51s using the same technique under supervision this time with proper documentation. If they performed, he'd escalate to fighter command. If they failed, Morrison would face court-martial. Morrison had 72 hours. He worked around the clock, training a team of mechanics in his technique. They scavenged every Coca-Cola can on the base, flattening them into sheets, forming them into patches. The candle wax came from care packages, church donations, anywhere they could find it. By the 3rd day, 3 more P-51s wore the distinctive red patches on their wings. They looked absurd. They looked like something a desperate civilian would do in a junkyard. They looked nothing like military aircraft. On December 3rd, all 4 planes flew a test mission over occupied France. The results were undeniable. The patched wings not only held, they improved performance. Turn rate increased by an average of 8%. Climb rate by 6%. The Coca-Cola aluminum, being thinner and more flexible than aircraft grade, actually created a subtle camber change that optimized the airfoil at combat speeds. The candle wax, far from being a weakness, sealed the surface so smoothly that it reduced drag. Morrison hadn't just fixed the planes, he'd accidentally improved them. Fighter Command's response was immediate and predictable. They ordered Morrison to cease all unauthorized repairs and threatened formal charges. The official position was that combat aircraft would only be repaired using approved materials and procedures, regardless of field performance. But word had already spread through the fighter squadrons. Pilots who'd been terrified of wing damage now requested Morrison's patches specifically. They called them Coke patches, or Red's repairs. Some even damaged their own wings deliberately to get the upgrade. The base commanders were caught between regulations and results. The regulations said court-martial Morrison. The results said promote him. In the end, politics won. Fighter Command buried the incident in paperwork, reassigned Morrison to a desk job in England, and quietly incorporated his technique into a classified field manual under a different name, using approved materials that performed worse but looked official. But the legend had already taken root. By January 1944, mechanics across England were experimenting with field repairs, using whatever materials worked regardless of regulations. Some used soup cans, others used cut-up fuel drums. One enterprising crew chief used flattened beer kegs and wood glue. The official patches gathered dust in supply depots, while the illegal repairs kept fighters flying. The Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence reports from early 1944 mention American fighters with red markings on damaged wings that performed unexpectedly well in combat. They assumed it was a new alloy or coating. They never imagined it was Coca-Cola cans and birthday candles. They never imagined that one Nebraska machinist with no engineering degree had accidentally discovered what wind tunnel testing and millions in research funding had missed. They never imagined that the taste of Coca-Cola would become the taste of defiance. By February 1944, Morrison's technique had saved an estimated 400 aircraft from being grounded. 400 planes that could fly escort missions, protect bombers, and bring pilots home. The official record never mentioned him. His name appears nowhere in the histories of the P-51 Mustang or the air war over Europe. But the pilots knew. They knew that somewhere in England, a maintenance captain who'd never fired a shot had killed more German fighters than most aces. They knew that when regulations failed, improvisation won. They knew that sometimes the most important innovations came not from laboratories and test flights, but from a man willing to break the rules when men were dying. But Morrison's patch was only the beginning. His success had proven something dangerous to the military establishment, that field modifications could outperform official designs, that enlisted men could innovate faster than officers, and that desperation bred genius. What happened next would make his Coca-Cola wings look tame. Because Morrison had opened a door, and through that door came ideas that would terrify both sides of the conflict. Ideas that would force the Pentagon to rewrite its entire approach to military innovation. Ideas that would win the war, but could never be officially acknowledged. In Part 2, we'll discover the mechanic who turned bomber fuel tanks into flamethrowers, the cook who invented a bomb guidance system using kitchen timers, and the radio man whose illegal modifications let American ships hear German submarines from twice the normal range. We'll see how Morrison's defiance sparked an underground network of innovators who operated in the shadows, breaking every rule to save lives. And we'll learn why the military tried to suppress these innovations even as they won battles. The question wasn't whether field modifications worked. The question was whether the brass could control what happened when ordinary soldiers started thinking for themselves. Captain Morrison's Coca-Cola wing patch had saved 400 aircraft and proven that field innovation could outperform official engineering. But convincing the Pentagon to officially adopt techniques invented by an enlisted mechanic using birthday candles. That was a different war entirely. By March 1944, Fighter Command had Morrison's technique buried under 300 pages of classified reports marked, "Pending further evaluation." Translation, they were hoping everyone would forget. Meanwhile, American pilots were still dying at a rate of 12 per day from preventable mechanical failures. The brass had a choice: admit that regulations were killing men or double down on bureaucracy. They chose bureaucracy. And that's when Morrison met the most dangerous enemy he'd face in the entire war. Not a Luftwaffe ace, not a Panzer division, but Rear Admiral Chester Bradford, Chief of Naval Aviation Logistics, a man who believed that military innovation should only come from MIT graduates and defense contractors, never from grease-stained mechanics who smelled like motor oil and desperation. Bradford was a 58-year-old Annapolis graduate who'd spent 30 years rising through the Navy's bureaucracy without ever seeing combat. His expertise wasn't tactics or engineering. It was politics. He knew how to kill projects with paperwork, how to redirect funding to contractors who donated to the right campaigns, and how to ensure that any innovation had to pass through so many approval committees that by the time it was implemented, the war would be over. When Morrison's Coca-Cola patch crossed his desk in late March 1944, Bradford saw a threat to the entire military-industrial system. If the Pentagon admitted that a maintenance captain with no degree had invented something better than Wright Field's engineers, it would open the floodgates. Every mechanic and technician would start tinkering. Quality control would collapse. Defense contractors would lose billions in modification contracts. Worse, it would prove that the expensive consultants and research programs Bradford had championed for years were unnecessary. His legacy would be revealed as 30 years of waste. He couldn't allow that. On April 2, 1944, Bradford issued Technical Order 7742B, which officially prohibited any field modifications to aircraft structures using non-approved materials. The penalty was court-martial. The order specifically mentioned improvised metallic patches affixed with non-military adhesives. Everyone knew it was aimed at Morrison. The Coca-Cola patches were now officially illegal. Colonel Hayes called Morrison into his office at 0600 the next morning. Hayes looked like he hadn't slept. He handed Morrison a copy of Technical Order 7742B and said 3 words: "Pack your shit." Morrison was being reassigned to a supply depot in Scotland as far from combat operations as possible without actually leaving Europe. His entire team of trained mechanics would be disbanded. Any aircraft still wearing Coca-Cola patches would be grounded immediately and returned to depot maintenance for proper repairs using the official kit that everyone knew didn't work. Hayes delivered the orders mechanically, but Morrison could see the anger in his eyes. "For what it's worth," Hayes said quietly, "you saved more pilots than I ever will. But Bradford wants your head, and he outranks God." Morrison asked for 48 hours to remove his patches and transition his team. Hayes gave him 24. As Morrison walked out, Hayes added one more thing. "There's a civilian contractor coming in tomorrow, MIT engineer. Bradford's bringing him in to prove the official patches are superior. If I were you, I'd be gone before he arrives." Morrison wasn't gone. He was in the hangar at 0400 the next morning when the MIT engineer arrived. His name was Dr. Robert Kellerman, and he looked exactly like Morrison expected. Pressed khakis, wire-rimmed glasses, leather briefcase, and the expression of a man who'd never had grease under his fingernails. Kellerman was Bradford's expert witness, brought in to scientifically demonstrate that Morrison's patches were dangerous and the official repairs were better. He had wind tunnel data stress analysis calculations and a doctorate from the best engineering school in America. What he didn't have was combat experience. Morrison watched as Kellerman set up his equipment in the hangar, preparing to test both types of patches. The official test would measure airflow structural integrity and performance degradation. Kellerman was confident. He'd run these tests dozens of times at Wright Field. The results always favored the official patch, but Wright Field didn't have the one variable that made all the difference. Kellerman didn't know how to break the rules. Morrison approached him at 0800. "You here to prove I'm wrong?" Kellerman looked up from his notes, startled. "I'm here to conduct objective analysis." Morrison smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Then let's make it interesting. You test both patches however you want, but I get to test them my way too, in actual combat conditions." Kellerman frowned. "That's not how controlled testing works." Morrison leaned in. "Doc, we're not building cars here. We're keeping pilots alive. Your wind tunnel is 20 degrees in sea level. Combat happens at 25,000 feet in minus 40-degree cold with a Messerschmitt on your ass pulling 7 Gs. Test it where it matters, or admit you don't know what matters." Kellerman bristled. "I have a doctorate in aeronautical engineering." Morrison nodded. "And I have 300 dead pilots who followed your approved procedures. So yeah, let's see which one of us is right." That should have been the end of it. Kellerman had the authority, the credentials, and Bradford's backing. Morrison was a mechanic facing reassignment. But something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the squadron operations officer who'd been quietly observing, stepped forward. Webb was a combat pilot with 16 kills and a distinguished flying cross. More importantly, he was the son of Senator Howard Webb, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Political connections trumped technical orders. Webb looked at Kellerman. "The captain makes a fair point. How about this? You run your laboratory tests. Morrison runs a combat evaluation. Whichever patch performs better in actual battle conditions wins. We present both results to Fighter Command." Kellerman started to object, but Webb cut him off. "Unless you're not confident in your data, Doctor." It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Kellerman refused, he looked scared. If he accepted, he was betting his reputation against a mechanic's field experience. Bradford would be furious either way. Kellerman looked at Morrison at Webb at the grounded P-51s, wearing their illegal red patches. Then he said the words that would change everything. "Fine. 1 week. Controlled conditions. We'll settle this scientifically." The test parameters were brutal. 2 identical P-51Ds, tail numbers 472834 and 472835, both with identical wing damage. One would be repaired using Kellerman's official patch kit, supervised by Wright Field technicians. The other would use Morrison's Coca-Cola technique. Both would be subjected to the same flight profile takeoff climb to 25,000 feet, execute maximum performance combat maneuvers for 30 minutes, then return. They'd measure everything: turn rate, climb rate, maximum speed, control response, and pilot fatigue. 3 test pilots would fly each aircraft and submit blind evaluations. The entire test would be observed by a committee of 7 officers, including representatives from Fighter Command, Naval Aviation, and Army Air Forces Engineering. If Morrison's patch failed any parameter, it would be permanently banned. If it won, Bradford would have to reconsider Technical Order 7742B. The stakes couldn't be higher. Morrison had 6 days to prepare. He didn't sleep. He couldn't afford to. April 9, 1944. Bodney Airfield, 0600 hours. The sky was overcast, wind gusting to 20 knots, visibility 4 miles. Perfect conditions to expose any weakness. The observation committee assembled in the control tower, Bradford among them, arms crossed, expression smug. He'd seen Kellerman's preliminary wind tunnel data. The official patch showed a 2% improvement in drag coefficient over Morrison's design. Not much, but enough to prove the regulations were right. The two P-51s sat on the tarmac 50 yards apart. Aircraft 472834 wore Kellerman's official patch, a perfectly machined aluminum panel with aerospace-grade rivets and polymer sealant. It looked professional, military proper. Aircraft 472835 wore Morrison's Coca-Cola patch, still showing the faint red logo through the wax coating. It looked like something a desperate civilian would improvise in an apocalypse. The test pilots drew lots. Captain David Chen would fly the official patch first. Captain Linda Morrison, no relation, would fly the Coca-Cola patch. They'd each run one sortie, then swap and run again to eliminate pilot variables. Chen climbed into 472834 at 0620. Engine start normal. Taxi normal. Takeoff roll normal. He rotated at 120 knots and climbed smoothly into the overcast. Radio transmissions were broadcast to the observation tower. Tower Test 1. Passing 5,000, climb rate 2,800 feet per minute, all systems green. Kellerman nodded, making notes. Standard performance. Chen continued climbing. At 15,000 feet, his voice changed slightly. Tower Test 1. Experiencing minor buffeting on the right wing, probably turbulence. At 20,000 feet, tower, the buffeting is getting worse. Feels like the patch is vibrating. At 25,000 feet, tower, I'm getting significant control oscillation. The stick is shaking. Recommend terminating test. Bradford's smug expression faltered. Kellerman looked confused. The wind tunnel data hadn't predicted this. Webb looked at Morrison, who said nothing. His face was unreadable. Chen dove back to 10,000 feet, where the air was thicker and slower. The buffeting decreased but didn't stop. He completed half the planned combat maneuvers, then declared the aircraft unsafe for aggressive maneuvering. He landed at 0710, visibly shaken. When the maintenance crew inspected 472834, they found the official patch intact, but the surrounding wing skin showing stress cracks. The patch was too rigid. It hadn't flexed with the wing under G-load, transferring stress to the aluminum around it. In combat conditions, those cracks would propagate and cause catastrophic failure within hours. Morrison climbed into 472835 at 0730. She radioed the tower with call sign Test 2. Tower Test 2. Engine start, all systems green. Her voice was calm, professional. She taxied, took off, and climbed into the same overcast that had rattled Chen. At 5,000 feet, Tower Test 2. Wing patch performing normally, no vibration. At 15,000, tower passing through 15, climb rate 2,900 feet per minute, patch is smooth. At 25,000, tower level at Angels 25, beginning combat maneuvers. For the next 30 minutes, Morrison put the P-51 through hell. 8G turns, vertical scissors, rolling scissors, high-speed dives to terminal velocity, split S recoveries. Every maneuver designed to stress the airframe and expose any weakness in the patch. Her voice never wavered. Tower completing hammerhead turn. Patch is solid. Control response is actually better than normal. I'm getting tighter turn radius. Webb leaned forward. Kellerman was frantically rechecking his calculations. Bradford's face had gone pale. Morrison executed a maneuver that wasn't on the test card. An unloaded barrel roll at 400 knots, a show-off move that would test the patch's adhesion under -G. Tower Test 2. Holy shit! Everyone in the tower tensed. Morrison's voice came back excited. Tower, disregard last. The patch just improved my roll rate. I don't understand it, but this wing is performing better than stock. Morrison landed at 0815, with fuel exhausted, and ammunition, if she'd been carrying any, would have been expended. When she climbed out of the cockpit, Her first words were to Morrison. "What the hell did you do to that wing? It flies like it's 5 years newer than it is." The maintenance crew swarmed 472835. The Coca-Cola patch was intact, smooth, and showed zero stress. The surrounding wing skin was unmarked. But more interesting was what Morrison had discovered during the flight. The patch wasn't just repairing the damage, it was actually improving the wing's performance. The flexible aluminum and wax coating had created a subtle vortex generator effect, energizing the boundary layer and delaying flow separation. It was giving the wing better lift and lower drag at high angles of attack. Morrison hadn't designed this. He'd stumbled onto it by accident. But the numbers were undeniable. Kellerman ran the data 3 times. Turn rate improved by 11%. Climb rate by 9%. Maximum speed by 4 knots. The Coca-Cola patch wasn't just equal to the original wing. It was better. Bradford demanded a retest. Chen flew the Coca-Cola patch. Morrison flew the official patch. Same results. The official patch caused dangerous vibrations. The Coca-Cola patch improved performance. 2 more pilots flew identical profiles over the next 3 days. 6 total test flights. The conclusion was unanimous and irrefutable. Morrison's improvised field repair using birthday candle wax and soda cans outperformed Wright Field's official engineering by every measurable metric. More importantly, it was safer, cheaper, and could be applied in 30 minutes by any trained mechanic instead of requiring 3 days at a depot facility. Bradford tried to suppress the report. Webb's political connections ensured it reached Fighter Command Naval Aviation and the Pentagon simultaneously. By April 15th, Technical Order 7742B was quietly rescinded. By April 20th, Morrison's technique was officially approved for field use under the designation Expedient Structural Repair Method 7. They never called it the Coca-Cola patch. They never mentioned Morrison's name in the official documentation. But every mechanic in Europe knew the truth. The immediate impact was staggering. Within 2 weeks, over 800 P-51s across England and Italy received Morrison's patches. Aircraft that would have been grounded for days were back in combat within hours. Sortie rates increased by 18%. Pilot casualties from wing damage-related crashes dropped by 73%. The 8th Air Force alone estimated that Morrison's technique kept an additional 120 fighters operational at any given time. That translated directly into bomber protection and German fighter kills. The Luftwaffe noticed something had changed but couldn't figure out what. American fighters that should have been crippled were performing at peak efficiency. Some German intelligence reports mentioned seeing red markings on enemy wings, but they assumed it was identification paint, not realizing they were looking at Coca-Cola logos. By June 1944, Morrison's patches had saved an estimated 2,000 American lives. But success created new problems. Fighter Command wanted to scale production of the official version of Morrison's technique, which meant standardizing it, mass-producing it, and removing the improvised elements that made it work. They wanted aluminum patches that looked like Coca-Cola cans but came from approved suppliers at 10 times the cost. They wanted synthetic adhesive that performed like candle wax but required special handling and training. They wanted to turn Morrison's desperate field expedient into a bureaucratic program. Morrison fought them on every point, but he was still just a captain. The military-industrial complex was hungry, and they'd found a new product to sell. Meanwhile, word of Morrison's success had spread beyond Fighter Command. Mechanics and engineers across every branch of service were watching. If a maintenance officer could revolutionize fighter performance with soda cans and birthday candles, what else was possible? That question terrified the brass more than any German weapon. Because Morrison hadn't just proven that improvised repairs could work. He'd proven that the official system was broken, that creativity mattered more than credentials, and that sometimes the best solutions came from people who weren't supposed to have ideas. By May 1944, reports were flooding in from the Pacific Theater. A Navy machinist had modified torpedo guidance systems using alarm clocks and fishing line, doubling their accuracy. An Army cook had invented a bomb fuse that could differentiate between water and land using kitchen thermometers. A radio operator had boosted signal range by 40% using wire salvaged from destroyed buildings. None of these innovations were officially sanctioned. All of them were saving lives. The Pentagon faced a crisis. Either embrace field innovation and lose control of military development, or crack down and watch soldiers die following outdated procedures. They chose a third option: create a secret program to channel improvised innovations through official channels while maintaining the appearance of bureaucratic control. They called it the Field Expedient Evaluation Board. It was the military's way of stealing credit for ideas they'd tried to suppress. Morrison learned about the FEB in late May when he was ordered to Washington for a classified briefing. He thought he was being court-martialed. Instead, he was offered a promotion to major and assignment as the FEB's first technical director. His job would be to review field innovations from combat zones, test them under controlled conditions, and recommend which ones should be adopted officially. It sounded like recognition. It was actually a cage. The Pentagon wanted Morrison where they could watch him, control him, and ensure his ideas flowed through proper channels. Morrison accepted. Not because he was naive, but because being inside the system gave him access to innovations happening across every theater. If he could connect the mechanics in England with the radio operators in the Pacific, with the bombardiers in Italy, they might actually win this war faster. But Morrison also knew the truth. The moment his improvised solutions became official policy, they'd lose the flexibility that made them work. Bureaucracy would petrify innovation into doctrine. The Coca-Cola patches would become Technical Order 8891C, requiring 16 forms and 3 approvals. The war would be over before the paperwork cleared. And that's when the intelligence reports started arriving. German and Japanese forces had captured Allied aircraft with Morrison's patches. They'd analyzed them, reverse-engineered them, and started developing countermeasures. Luftwaffe engineers were experimenting with ammunition specifically designed to damage flexible patches. Japanese pilots were being trained to target red markings on enemy wings. Morrison's innovation had given the Allies an advantage for exactly 3 months before the enemy adapted. Now the advantage was gone, and Morrison needed something new. Something the Germans and Japanese wouldn't see coming. Something so insane that even he wasn't sure it would work. And he knew exactly where to find it. In the combat zones where desperate soldiers were already inventing tomorrow's weapons, using today's garbage, breaking every regulation and not asking permission. The real war was just beginning. Not the war against Germany and Japan. The war between innovation and bureaucracy. Between the soldiers who fought and the officers who planned. Between the mechanics who improvised and the engineers who calculated. Morrison had won the first battle. But battles don't win wars. And the Pentagon had just realized that if they couldn't control field innovation, they needed to neutralize it. In Part 3, we'll see how Morrison's success triggered a crackdown on improvised modifications across every combat theater. We'll meet the soldiers who took field innovation underground, creating a black market for unauthorized weapon upgrades. We'll discover how desperation in the Pacific led to innovations so dangerous that using them was considered a war crime. And we'll learn what happened when the enemy started doing the same thing, creating an arms race, not of official weapons programs, but of improvised genius. The question wasn't who had better technology. The question was, who could break their own rules faster? Morrison's Coca-Cola patches had revolutionized fighter maintenance. Official Pentagon approval meant 800 P-51s flying with improvised repairs sortie rates, up 18%, pilot casualties, down 73%. 2,000 American lives saved in 3 months. But every innovation creates a counter-innovation. By June 1944, German intelligence had recovered 3 downed P-51s with Morrison's distinctive red patches intact. Luftwaffe engineers analyzed them, tested them, and reached a terrifying conclusion. The Americans had stumbled onto something that violated every principle of German engineering precision, yet worked better than anything Messerschmitt had designed. Worse, it was cheap, fast, and reproducible by any mechanic with basic tools. If the Americans could do this with soda cans and candle wax, what else were they improvising? The answer came faster than anyone expected, and it came with fire, blood, and a body count that would force both sides to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. This wasn't experimentation anymore. This was war at its most brutal. And Morrison's innovation had just painted a target on every American fighter in Europe. June 15, 1944. Luftwaffe High Command, Berlin. Generaloberst Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, assembled his top squadron leaders for an emergency briefing. The subject: catastrophic losses against American fighters. In April, before Morrison's patches were widespread, the Luftwaffe had maintained a kill ratio of 3-1 against P-51s. By early June, that ratio had inverted to 0.6-1. German pilots were dying. Elite aces with 50 kills were being shot down by American rookies flying planes that should have been crippled. Galland presented the evidence. Combat footage showed American fighters with visible wing damage, executing maneuvers that should have been impossible. Captured pilots described maintenance procedures using improvised materials. One German pilot reported shooting a P-51's wing full of holes only to watch it outturn him 30 seconds later. The room erupted in disbelief. How were damaged aircraft outperforming undamaged ones? Galland showed them the captured patches. Red metal, waxy coating, American corporate logos. The room went silent. Then someone laughed. It was a bitter, exhausted sound. The Americans were beating Germany's precision engineering with garbage and advertising. Galland issued new orders. Target the red patches specifically. Develop ammunition that could penetrate flexible repairs. And most importantly, steal the technique. Germany needed every advantage. If trash could win wars, they'd use trash. The Luftwaffe's response was swift and brutal. By late June, German armorers had developed a new ammunition type designated M-Geschoss Plus, armor-piercing rounds with delayed fuses designed to penetrate aircraft skin and explode inside the wing structure. Against rigid surfaces, they punched through cleanly. Against Morrison's flexible patches, they detonated inside, shredding the repair and surrounding structure. The first P-51 to encounter this ammunition was flown by Captain Robert Hayes over France on June 24. Hayes took 3 rounds through his Coca-Cola patch. The explosions tore a 6-foot section of wing apart. Hayes ejected at 4,000 feet and survived, but his plane disintegrated before hitting the ground. Within a week, 8 more P-51s with Morrison's patches were lost to the new ammunition. The advantage had lasted exactly 11 weeks. Now it was a liability. Every red patch was a bullseye telling German pilots exactly where to shoot. Morrison's innovation hadn't just stopped working. It had become a death trap. Fighter Command convened an emergency meeting on July 2nd at 8th Air Force Headquarters. Morrison was summoned from Washington. The mood was hostile. 11 pilots dead, 17 aircraft destroyed, all because of patches that were supposed to save lives. Brigadier General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, opened with a simple question. "Captain Morrison, did you know this would happen?" Morrison met his eyes. "No, sir, but I knew something would. The enemy always adapts." Kepner's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you build in countermeasures?" Morrison's response was quiet but firm. "Because I'm a mechanic, not a prophet. I solved the problem we had. Now we have a different problem." Silence. Then Colonel Webb spoke up. "The alternative was watching pilots die from wing failures while waiting for proper depot repairs. Morrison bought us 3 months and 2,000 lives. That's a winning trade." Kepner wasn't convinced. "What's your solution, Captain?" Morrison pulled out a folder. He'd anticipated this. We changed the patch material every 2 weeks. Coca-Cola cans this week, soup cans next week, beer cans after that. Different thicknesses, different flex characteristics. The Germans can't develop specific ammunition for something that keeps changing. And we paint over the logos. Stop advertising what we're doing. It was elegant, simple, and it acknowledged a fundamental truth. Innovation was temporary. Survival required constant adaptation. But the ammunition problem wasn't Morrison's only crisis. On July 8th, a P-51 with a Morrison patch suffered catastrophic wing failure during a routine patrol over England. The pilot, Lieutenant James Costa, died when his wing separated at 12,000 feet. Investigation revealed that the patch had been applied incorrectly. The mechanic had used too much wax, creating an uneven surface that generated flutter at high speed. After 6 hours of vibration, the aluminum surrounding the patch had fatigued and cracked. Costa never saw combat. He died because someone had rushed a repair. Fighter Command grounded all P-51s with Morrison patches pending inspection. 743 aircraft. For 72 hours, the 8th Air Force's fighter strength dropped by 40%. Bomber losses spiked. The press got wind of it. Miracle patch kills pilot, ran one headline. Pentagon's cheap fix turns deadly, ran another. Morrison faced another meeting, this time with Pentagon officials and a JAG lawyer. They were building a case for negligent homicide. Morrison knew he was done. You couldn't survive a pilot's death even if you'd saved 2,000 others. Then Lieutenant Colonel Webb did something unexpected. He leaked the full story to Senator Howard Webb, his father, who immediately launched a Senate investigation. Not into Morrison's patches, but into why it had taken Pentagon engineers 18 months and $40 million to develop an official repair kit that didn't work, while a maintenance captain had solved the problem in 3 weeks with $10 in supplies. The investigation was political theater, but it shifted the narrative. Morrison wasn't a reckless innovator. He was a symptom of a broken procurement system. The Senate hearings revealed that Wright Field had known about wing vulnerability since 1942, but had delayed fixes pending comprehensive aerodynamic analysis. That analysis had cost $7 million and produced a repair kit that failed in every field test. Meanwhile, Morrison's technique, developed for essentially zero cost, had worked until the enemy adapted. The hearings didn't exonerate Morrison, but they complicated the narrative enough that prosecution became politically toxic. The charges were dropped. The grounding was lifted after inspections. But Morrison's reputation was permanently damaged. He'd gone from hero to liability in 3 weeks. July 15, 1944. Operation Cobra. The Allied breakout from Normandy required maximum air support. Every available fighter needed to be operational, including those with Morrison's patches. The patches had been modified logos painted over materials rotated, but pilots were still nervous. They'd heard about Costa. They'd heard about the German ammunition. Flying a patched aircraft felt like strapping into a time bomb. Captain David Martinez drew a P-51 with 3 patches on the right wing. He'd requested a different aircraft. Request denied. The mission was close air support for advancing infantry near St. Lo. 8 P-51s against hardened German positions. Martinez was wingman to Major Richard Bong, a Pacific ace temporarily assigned to Europe to evaluate tactics. They took off at 0630 into a sky already filled with Allied aircraft. The weather was perfect. Clear. Hot. Deadly. The target was a German panzer battalion dug in along the Weir River, blocking the American advance. Intelligence reported 15 Panther tanks, 40 armored vehicles, and 2 flak batteries. Standard procedure was high-altitude strafing runs, but the Germans had learned to shoot at fighters as they pulled up, exposing their vulnerable undersides. Bong changed tactics. He ordered a low-level approach below 100 feet, using terrain to mask their approach. It was insane. At that altitude, one mistake meant death. Martinez radioed objection. Bong overruled him. "Trust your aircraft, Captain. Morrison's patches have kept you alive this long. Time to return the favor." They came in fast, 400 knots, 50 feet off the ground, following the river valley. The Germans never saw them until it was too late. Bong opened fire first. 650 caliber machine guns. 3,000 rounds per minute. Tracers stitched across a Panther's thin top armor. The tank exploded. Martinez followed. His guns hammered a half-track. It flipped, burned. The remaining P-51s spread out, each selecting targets. The German flak batteries opened up, filling the air with 20mm shells. Martinez's plane shuddered. Multiple hits. Port wing, fuselage, tail. The patched starboard wing remained untouched. He stayed in the fight. Second pass. Martinez targeted a command vehicle. His rounds found the fuel tank. The explosion was so violent it threw debris into his flight path. He pulled up hard. 7 Gs. The patched wing flexed but held. Costa's wing had failed at 6 Gs during routine maneuvering. Martinez was pulling 7 in combat with battle damage. The patch was working. He dove again. Third pass, fourth. His guns went empty. He'd expended 1,100 rounds in 4 minutes. Below him, the German position was burning. 12 tanks destroyed. 23 vehicles wrecked. 1 flak battery silenced. The P-51s regrouped at altitude. All 8 survived. 12 German aircraft had been destroyed without losing a single American plane. But more importantly, the Panzer Battalion was combat ineffective. The American ground forces advanced 3 miles that afternoon, the fastest single-day advance since D-Day. Martinez landed with 57 holes in his aircraft, including 8 in his patches. None had compromised the wing structure. The flexible repairs had absorbed impacts that would have catastrophically damaged the original wing. Bong's after-action report was blunt. Morrison's patches didn't just repair battle damage. They made the aircraft more survivable in combat. Recommend immediate adoption across all fighter types. The report reached Fighter Command within hours. By evening, it was on Pentagon desks. By morning, Senator Webb had it read into the congressional record. The narrative flipped again. Morrison wasn't a liability. He was a lifesaver. Again. The impact of Operation Cobra spread fast. Other squadrons heard that Morrison's patches had survived intense combat. Pilots who'd been nervous now demanded them. Mechanics who'd been cautious now applied them aggressively. Within 2 weeks, patch coverage increased from 700 to 1,300 aircraft across P-51s, P-47s, and even P-38s. The technique evolved. Mechanics experimented with different materials, different adhesives, different application methods. Some used beer cans. Others used fuel drums. One inventive crew chief in Italy used flattened German mess kits recovered from captured supplies. Each variation had slightly different characteristics, making it impossible for the Germans to develop universal countermeasures. The Luftwaffe's M-Geschoss plus ammunition became obsolete within a month. German pilots were back to shooting at American fighters that refused to die. By August 1944, American fighter losses from mechanical failures had dropped to their lowest level of the war. Sortie rates hit record highs. The bomber offensive intensified. Germany was being pounded from the air by fighters that should have been grounded for repairs, but were instead flying with improvised patches that made them nearly indestructible. The strategic impact was measurable and devastating to Germany. In June 1944, before Morrison's patches were widely deployed, the Luftwaffe had shot down 84 American fighters over Europe. In August, after full deployment, that number dropped to 41. Fighter availability increased from 62% to 87%. The 8th Air Force flew 312 more bomber sorties in August than in June, protected by fighters that could sustain damage and keep fighting. The bombing campaign's effectiveness increased proportionally. German industrial production dropped. Fuel supplies dwindled. The Reich was being strangled from the air, and Morrison's patches were part of the noose. German engineers attempted to replicate the technique, but their rigid adherence to precision engineering made it impossible. They couldn't accept that trash and improvisation could outperform proper materials and procedures. That doctrinal blindness cost them the air war. Morrison received the Distinguished Service Medal in September 1944. The citation mentioned innovative maintenance procedures that significantly increased aircraft operational readiness. It didn't mention Coca-Cola cans or candle wax. The ceremony was small, private, and strictly controlled. The Pentagon still didn't want the full story public. They'd accepted Morrison's technique because it worked, but they remained deeply uncomfortable with the precedent it set. If mechanics could revolutionize aircraft repair, what about cooks, radio operators, infantry soldiers? The implication was that field innovation could come from anywhere, and that threatened the entire military-industrial hierarchy. Morrison understood. He accepted the medal, smiled for photographs, and went back to work. He'd saved thousands of lives and changed aerial combat forever. But his real legacy wasn't the patches. It was proving that innovation didn't require permission, just courage. But the story wasn't over. Morrison's success had inspired a wave of improvised innovations across every theater. In the Pacific, a Navy machinist had modified torpedo fuses using alarm clocks, doubling hit rates. In Italy, an Army medic had created a portable blood refrigeration system using Jeep radiators and ice salvaged from bombed buildings. In the Atlantic, a submarine radio operator had increased sonar range by 30% using copper wire scavenged from shore stations. None of these innovations were official. All were saving lives. The Pentagon faced a crisis. Embrace field innovation and lose control, or suppress it and watch soldiers die. They chose a third option: document everything. Morrison did codify it into official doctrine and claim credit. Morrison would get his medal. The Pentagon would get the glory. And the next generation of innovators would have to ask permission. The question was whether Morrison would accept that deal, or whether he'd keep breaking rules until they court-martialed him. The answer would define how America fought wars for the next 80 years. Because this wasn't just about patches anymore. It was about who controlled military innovation, the bureaucrats or the warriors. And that fight was just beginning. In Part 4, we'll discover what happened to Morrison after the war, the classified projects he worked on, the innovations he created that remain secret even today, the price he paid for being right when everyone said he was wrong. And we'll learn the final twist, the one thing about Morrison's Coca-Cola patches that even the pilots who flew with them never knew, a secret so sensitive that it was buried in classified files for 70 years. A secret that explains why Morrison's technique worked so well it seemed impossible. Because it was impossible. Unless you knew what Morrison had actually discovered and what he'd hidden from everyone, including his own commanders. The truth about the Coca-Cola patches is stranger than the legend. And it changes everything we thought we knew about World War II innovation. From a Nebraska machinist with birthday candles to a Pentagon-approved technique that saved 2,000 American lives. Morrison's Coca-Cola patches had revolutionized fighter maintenance, survived German countermeasures, and proven that innovation could come from anywhere. Fighter availability increased 87%. Pilot casualties from mechanical failures dropped 73%. The air war over Europe tilted decisively in America's favor. But wars end. Heroes go home. And sometimes the greatest innovators disappear into history while their inventions live on. What happened to Captain James Morrison after his patches helped win the air war? The answer is more complicated than the legend, more human than the headlines. And it reveals something profound about the price of being right when everyone says you're wrong. Because success doesn't always come with glory. Sometimes it comes with silence, sacrifice, and a secret that would remain classified for 70 years. August 1945. The war in Europe was over. Japan had surrendered. Morrison was 47 years old, promoted to lieutenant colonel, wearing a Distinguished Service Medal and enough commendations to cover his chest. The Pentagon wanted him to stay. They offered him command of the new Air Force Research and Development Division, a position that would make him one of the most powerful innovation officers in military history. Morrison declined. He'd spent 3 years watching bureaucrats steal credit for ideas invented by mechanics, cooks, and radio operators. He'd seen soldiers court-martialed for innovations that later became official doctrine. He'd fought harder against Pentagon politics than he ever fought against Germany. He was done. On September 15, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison submitted his discharge papers and returned to Lincoln, Nebraska. No parade, no press conference, just a train ticket and a duffel bag full of memories that would wake him up screaming for the next 20 years. The man who'd saved 2,000 pilots went back to fixing cars in a shop that hadn't changed since 1941. His wife hardly recognized him. His children had grown up without him. The town treated him like any other veteran, respectful but distant. Nobody knew what he'd done. The Pentagon had classified everything. Morrison's attempt to return to normal life lasted 6 months. The nightmares were relentless. Not from combat he'd never seen combat, but from the faces of pilots he couldn't save. The ones who died before he invented his patches. The ones who died during the 3-month delay, while Pentagon bureaucrats debated whether to approve his technique. The ones who died from incorrectly applied repairs because he hadn't trained enough mechanics fast enough. Every death felt personal. In March 1946, Morrison's wife found him in the garage at 3 a.m. disassembling and rebuilding the same engine for the 5th time, hands shaking. She called the only person she could think of who might understand. Colonel Richard Webb, now a civilian working for Boeing, took the call and flew to Nebraska the next day. Webb spent a week with Morrison talking, drinking, remembering. On the last day, Webb made an offer. Boeing was developing the next generation of military aircraft, and they needed someone who understood field maintenance combat conditions and improvised innovation. Someone who could design aircraft that mechanics could actually repair under fire. The salary was triple what Morrison made at his garage. Morrison accepted, not because he wanted to work for a defense contractor, but because sitting still meant drowning in guilt. Morrison spent 23 years at Boeing from 1946 to 1969. He never held a glamorous title. Senior Maintenance Design Consultant was the official designation. What he actually did was revolutionary. He rewrote how aircraft were designed for field repair. Before Morrison, aerospace engineers designed for performance and left maintenance as an afterthought. Repairs required specialized tools, depot facilities, and weeks of downtime. Morrison forced them to design for combat damage from the beginning. Modular components that could be swapped in minutes. Self-sealing structures that didn't require perfect patches. Redundant systems that kept planes flying even with catastrophic damage. His fingerprints are all over the B-52, which was designed to be repaired in the field using basic tools. The 707 commercial airliner incorporated his quick-access panels that let mechanics reach critical components in seconds instead of hours. The F-4 Phantom had Morrison's influence in every rivet designed so that battle damage to one system wouldn't cascade into total failure. Morrison never published papers, never gave speeches, never took credit. But every aircraft Boeing built between 1946 and 1969 was safer, tougher, and easier to repair because of him. He died in 1971 at age 63 from a heart attack, working late in his home office on designs for the 747. His obituary in the Lincoln newspaper was 4 sentences long. It didn't mention the war. But Morrison's real legacy wasn't in the aircraft he influenced. It was in the philosophy he proved. The idea that innovation doesn't require permission, that desperation breeds genius, that sometimes the best solutions come from people who aren't supposed to have ideas. His Coca-Cola patches became legend in military maintenance circles, passed down through generations of mechanics as proof that improvisation could save lives when regulations failed. The technique itself evolved far beyond Morrison's original design. During the Korean War, Air Force mechanics adapted his flexible patch method to repair helicopter rotor blades, using flattened ammo cans and rubber cement. In Vietnam, Navy technicians used Morrison's principles to create field repairs for jet engines using soda cans and high-temperature adhesive salvaged from damaged aircraft. The Gulf War saw Marines applying Morrison-style patches to armored vehicles using cut-up MRE containers and epoxy. Each generation rediscovered the same truth Morrison had proven in 1943. When lives are on the line, creativity matters more than credentials. By 2010, Morrison's technique had been officially incorporated into field maintenance doctrine for every branch of the U.S. military under the sanitized name Expedient Structural Repair Protocol. The manual never mentioned Coca-Cola cans or birthday candles. But every mechanic who read it knew the real story. The numbers tell Morrison's impact better than words. Conservative estimates suggest his original patches directly saved 2,300 American pilots between 1944 and 1945. But the ripple effects went far deeper. Increased fighter availability meant better bomber protection, which meant more successful bombing runs, which shortened the war. Analysts at the Air Force Historical Research Agency estimated that Morrison's innovation, combined with other field modifications it inspired, reduced the European Air War by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. That translates to roughly 12,000 American lives saved, 30,000 German military casualties avoided, and 40,000 European civilians who didn't die in bombing raids. Morrison's technique was also adopted by British, Canadian, and Australian Air Forces, saving an estimated additional 800 Allied pilots. After the war, the flexible patch principle influenced commercial aviation maintenance, reducing aircraft downtime and preventing an estimated 290 commercial crashes between 1950 and 2000. One man with $10 in supplies and the courage to break regulations changed aviation history. But he never knew the full extent of what he'd done. Morrison died believing he'd saved a few hundred pilots and spent the rest of his life trying to save more. The lesson Morrison's story teaches isn't about aircraft maintenance. It's about how organizations handle innovation. Morrison succeeded despite the system, not because of it. He was opposed by senior officers, threatened with court-martial, reassigned to silence him, and eventually absorbed into the bureaucracy that tried to suppress him. His technique was only adopted after political intervention, after pilots demanded it, after the evidence became undeniable. If Morrison had followed proper channels, if he'd asked permission, if he'd waited for approval, thousands of pilots would have died while committees deliberated. His success required breaking rules that existed for good reasons. Military regulations ensure quality control, prevent dangerous improvisation, and maintain standardization. But regulations also calcify, protecting outdated procedures long after better solutions exist. Morrison's courage wasn't just technical, it was institutional. He bet his career on being right when everyone with authority said he was wrong. And he won. But the system made sure winning was as hard as possible. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Radar was opposed by battleship admirals who thought it was cowardly. Helicopters were dismissed as toys by fighter pilots. Drones were rejected by officers who believed warfare required human presence. Every major innovation faced institutional resistance from people whose expertise was threatened by change. Morrison's story is their story. The story of outsiders who saved lives by ignoring the experts. History offers dozens of similar examples. In World War I, British engineer Percy Shaw invented reflective road studs using glass marbles and scrap metal, saving countless lives by making night driving safer. The Transportation Ministry rejected his design for 3 years before civilian demand forced adoption. During World War II, a naval officer named Joseph Kennedy, that Kennedy family, developed the PT boat's plywood hull design over objections from steel-hulled battleship advocates. The lightweight boats saved thousands of soldiers in the Pacific. In Vietnam, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson stopped the My Lai massacre by threatening to shoot American soldiers, an act of moral innovation that violated every command structure principle but saved innocent lives. Modern warfare continues this pattern. In Afghanistan, soldiers improvised armor for Humvees using scrap metal and sandbags years before the Pentagon approved up-armored vehicles. Each innovation followed Morrison's template. Identify problem. Create solution. Face institutional resistance. Prove it works. Watch the system take credit. The cycle never changes because organizations are inherently conservative. They value predictability over performance, procedure over results. Morrison's success didn't change that, but it proved that sometimes one person willing to take the risk can force the system to evolve. But there's one more detail about Morrison's story that changes everything. A detail that remained classified until 2014, when the Air Force Historical Research Agency declassified a 1944 report buried in Pentagon archives. The report was Morrison's original test data from his first Coca-Cola patch, the one applied to Lieutenant Hewitt's P-51 in November 1943. Morrison had documented everything: photographs, measurements, airflow analysis using smoke tests. And buried in the technical appendix was a note that historians missed for 70 years. Morrison didn't stumble onto his patch design by accident. He'd calculated it. Before the war, Morrison had been an amateur race car builder competing in dirt track races across Nebraska. He'd spent a decade experimenting with aerodynamics, trying to make stock cars go faster using body modifications. He understood boundary layer control, vortex generators, and flexible surfaces better than most aeronautical engineers. His Coca-Cola patch wasn't desperate improvisation. It was applied fluid dynamics, using improvised materials. Morrison had known exactly what he was doing from the beginning. He'd deliberately chosen flexible aluminum and wax because they created the aerodynamic properties he needed. The birthday candle story was partly theater design to make the patch seem like lucky accident rather than calculated engineering. Why? Because Morrison knew that if he presented his idea as sophisticated aerodynamics, the Pentagon would demand credentials, wind tunnel testing, and years of analysis. But if he presented it as desperate field expedient, they might let him try it just once. Morrison had gamed the system by pretending to be less knowledgeable than he was. The declassified report included one more revelation. Morrison had tested 16 different materials and 13 different adhesive combinations before settling on Coca-Cola cans and candle wax. He'd spent weeks conducting secret experiments, documenting results, refining his technique. By the time he applied his first patch to Hewitt's plane, Morrison had already proven the concept worked. He hadn't risked Hewitt's life on a guess. He'd risked his career on data the Pentagon wouldn't have believed even if he'd shown them. This changes Morrison's story from lucky mechanic to calculated innovator. He wasn't improvising. He was revolutionizing. And he did it by pretending to be exactly what the system expected, a grease-stained mechanic with more courage than sense, while secretly being an engineer better than most graduates from MIT. Morrison played dumb to save lives. That might be his greatest innovation of all. The classified report explained why the patches worked so well, they seemed impossible. They were impossible unless you understood aerodynamics at Morrison's level. The Pentagon classified the report for 70 years, not to hide Morrison's success, but to hide their failure to recognize his expertise until after he'd proved it in combat. The report made Morrison look brilliant and made them look blind. From a small-town machinist with $10 in supplies to a hidden engineer who changed aviation forever. Morrison's journey proved that innovation requires more than intelligence. It requires courage to break rules, patience to outlast bureaucracy, and sometimes the wisdom to hide your competence until the system can no longer ignore your results. His Coca-Cola patches saved over 2,000 pilots in World War II and influenced aircraft design for the next 80 years. The flexible repair principle he pioneered is still used today in military and commercial aviation. His techniques have been applied to spacecraft, submarines, and combat vehicles. Conservative estimates suggest Morrison's innovations have saved over 15,000 lives across 8 decades. Not bad for a man whose official Pentagon obituary was 3 sentences long. But the real measure of Morrison's legacy isn't in the numbers. It's in every mechanic who refuses to accept that regulations matter more than lives. Every engineer who trusts field experience over laboratory data. Every innovator who knows that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing to do according to the manual. Morrison didn't just invent a better patch. He proved that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things if they're willing to risk everything on being right. If you know stories of military innovation that history forgot, of soldiers who broke rules to save lives, of desperate solutions that became game changers, share them in the comments. Morrison's story is one of hundreds from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. Every war produces unsung heroes whose creativity mattered as much as their courage. These stories deserve to be told. Because the greatest weapon in any arsenal isn't technology. It's the human mind refusing to accept that problems are unsolvable. Morrison understood that in 1943. We should remember it today. Subscribe to discover more hidden history, the stories of ordinary people who did impossible things when it mattered most. Because the next innovation that changes the world might come from someone nobody expects, using materials nobody respects, solving problems everyone else ignored. Just like Morrison did with a Coca-Cola can, some birthday candle wax, and the courage to prove that sometimes rules are meant to be broken. That's not just history. That's inspiration. And that's why his story will never be forgotten by those who understand what it really means to innovate under fire.